Welcome. Do not be dissuaded by the title of this video. It's going to be interesting. This is Decrypting the Law, your source for legal insights about the tokenized future. I'm Jason Somensatto, the Strategic Legal Counsel on the 0x Core team. Same disclaimer I always start with. I'm a lawyer, but I'm not your lawyer. So don't take anything I say here today as legal advice. Another disclaimer, the topic for today, derivatives, is not one that I've historically spent a ton of time looking at the regulatory regimes for, although I did a lot of research for this. So if I get some stuff wrong, happy to be corrected, but I was fascinated by this. I hope you find it interesting. As I said, we're talking derivatives. Specifically, we're going to get into everything from the financial crisis to sports betting to obviously crypto. And it'll be an interesting history lesson that hopefully teaches us something. What should it teach you? If there was two things I hope you take away from today, the first is that derivatives regulation seems to be a creature of history and not like a single defining moment of comprehensive policy decision making. And so ultimately the result is kind of a weird patchwork of regulations. And there's not like an obvious reason, for example, why financial derivative products are regulated in the way they are, and things like sports betting are regulated in a completely different manner by different regulators. The other big takeaway that I hope you take from today is that derivatives regulation is focused on, or the history of derivatives regulation shows a focus on two primary policy concerns. One is stability and transparency in these markets in an effort to kind of contain risk. And then the second is in mitigating kind of pure speculative trading while still allowing for socially encouraged hedging activity. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But before we get too deep, let's just define what are we talking about when we're talking about a derivative. A derivative is a financial transaction in the form of a contract that pays out based on the value of some underlying asset or specific future event. In other words, a derivative is just a bet on a future occurrence. And when we're talking about derivatives, I think it's important to kind of keep two separate concepts in mind. One is the derivative itself, which again is a contract between parties, right? If something happens, then you pay me money, essentially. And then the second concept is the underlying commodity, asset, event on which the derivative is based. And we'll talk a little bit more about the kind of things that can be the subject of derivatives contracts, these underlyings. As I've kind of alluded to, derivatives are really helpful tools for hedging risk. That being said, they're also very efficient tools for speculative trading. We'll talk a little bit about why that is. But if you still don't fully get the concept of a derivative, let's just use a couple really simple examples. So as you probably captured, like sports betting is a type of derivative, maybe not legally considered that way, but if Tiger Woods wins the Masters next year, then you pay me $100. Okay. An insurance contract looks very much the same, right? If my house burns down, then you, the insurance company, pay me the cost to replace it. Another form of derivative is kind of the traditional financial derivatives that some of you might be familiar with. Like, think of an options contract, right? If the market price of corn falls below $4, well, I can still choose to sell to you corn at $4. And if you're like a computer programmer or a coder, which I'm not, but you might see a pattern in these examples, right? Which is the if this, then that structure, which is one of the reasons that like smart contracts and is kind of a natural fit for certain derivative concepts. I think like to understand derivatives, you have to understand their purpose. The purpose is to trade financial risk through a contract without having to trade the underlying asset, right? If you want to be exposed to the risk of owning my home, you don't actually have to buy and own my home. We can do a contract, in the form of kind of an insurance contract that moves that risk from my book to yours. All right. So what does all of this have to do with crypto? Personally, my opinion, some of the coolest ideas in crypto involve the ability to create what appear to be kind of automated derivatives that I think have the possibility of leading to some really interesting marketplaces. Because as we've talked about, like smart contracts can kind of efficiently move scarce money or commodities between two accounts based on an if this then that paradigm that kind of sets up naturally for the derivatives model. So much of the discussion to date has been about securities on the blockchain and tokenized securities. And like, at least to me, that just seems like a way of taking a traditional marketplace and porting it over to new technology. Whereas some of the concepts for making derivatives more efficient and making it available to kind of retail users really opens up some interesting ideas. But I'm here to talk about regulation. And what I think from a crypto perspective, the reason what I'm going to talk about matters is because if you go back to those examples I talked about earlier, right? The sports bet, the insurance contract, the corn option, right? Well, all of those are regulated differently, right? Different regulators, different regulatory regimes. And we'll talk about why that is. But when we think about crypto, right, if you think of a platform like Augur that allows for the creation of any type of prediction market, whether it's sports betting, insurance, commodities, the idea that like one regulation would apply to that is crazy, right? Instead, it's multiple different regulatory regimes based on the nature of that specific underlying market that gets made. We have a tendency to think of everything in terms of crypto infrastructure, but that's not really the way the regulatory regime works in this area. So, as I've mentioned, history is what matters here. How did we get here? Let's do a little history lesson. So, historically, like when I say historically, I'm talking 1800s maybe. Derivatives were regulated in the US by distinguishing between kind of socially encouraged hedging and socially discouraged speculation. And the law only recognized derivatives trades in which the parties had some financial interest in the underlying asset or event as well. So in other words, like if you're a farmer, you could go to court to get your derivatives contract, like your futures contract on the price of corn, enforced because you own the corn and you had an interest in hedging that risk, right? Like when you put the seeds in the ground, what the price of the corn is going to be a year from now when you go to sell it or something along those lines is kind of unknown. And so you might have signed into a contract that hedges that risk. But a court would not enforce a derivatives contract where the parties did not have an interest in the underlying, so-called contracts for difference. So two parties simply speculating on, whether the farmer's corn would be worth a certain price in the future. Now, that's an interesting point. You were not prohibited from making those contracts, from entering those contracts, but you couldn't go to the court to enforce them. There was no legal mechanism to enforce them. And so the result was that parties who wanted to enter these contracts looked to private mechanisms for enforcing derivatives contracts. And it led to the formation of what would eventually become like our modern day derivatives exchanges and clearinghouses, right? These are centrally controlled locations that establish rules by which members can trade with each other and ensure that those trades will be cleared because there's a central party making sure one side doesn't take too much risk. And that there's enough collateral posted to clear the trade. And in a tale as old as financial markets, ultimately technological innovation came to these marketplaces, which increased the number of participants, which increased the size of these things. And then the law had to adapt, right? And the law evolved to ultimately sanction exchange trading of derivatives while prohibiting so-called off-exchange, over-the-counter, often referred to as OTC derivative tradings, right? The CFTC was created, it oversaw these regulated marketplaces, and these off-exchange trades were prohibited. But near the end of the 20th century, the derivatives market started to kind of quickly expand beyond traditional concepts of agricultural commodities, right? And soon you had financial firms trading derivatives on all types of underlying events: the price of interest rates, housing prices, currency exchange rates. And the definition of what could be an underlying asset for a derivatives trade expanded broadly, right? The CFTC's jurisdiction kind of, I want to show you just for a second the definition of a commodity here. So this ultimately defines kind of what markets can be made in futures and derivatives markets, and which markets that the CFTC has control over. And so if you look at this here, it talks about wheat, cotton, rice, corn, oats, right? But if you move down midway here, and I'll try to highlight it, right? At the end, it's all goods and articles. Okay, so basically everything, right? And then even broader, all services, rights, and interests, right? And the net result of all of this is basically everything's a commodity, right? Because we can ultimately make a futures market in virtually anything these days. With that kind of boom in trading of all types of different financial events through derivatives, industry participants started clamoring for something that we in the crypto industry talk a lot about, which is legal certainty, right? They wanted legal certainty about being able to, for example, conduct over-the-counter trades of derivatives. Now, where things start getting really interesting in the history is around the run-up to the 2008 financial crisis. So there's a lot of commentators and academics out there who think that the 2008 financial crisis can basically be traced back to the deregulation of the derivatives market. Most people are probably familiar with kind of what happened in the financial crisis, which was basically there was a lot of complex derivatives contracts that were tied to the housing market. And as housing prices went down, all those contracts kind of failed and caused risk to move around in ways that nobody's seen before. There's so many good books on this topic. I love learning about the financial crisis. My favorite is definitely Too Big to Fail by Andrew Ross Sorkin. Definitely give it a read. But in researching for today, I actually spent a good amount of time reading pieces by a law professor named Lynn Stout, who lays out a really good argument for why the financial crisis essentially starts with a year 2000 law called the Commodities Futures Modernization Act, that most notably deregulated OTC trading in financial derivatives. It allowed so-called eligible contract participants, think financial firms, really rich people, to engage in essentially purely speculative derivatives tradings one-on-one without using a regulated exchange. In summary, Stout argues that allowing financial firms this kind of unfettered ability to make what she considers to be non-productive speculative bets in these unregulated markets led to a huge increase in risk without a corresponding benefit that the system was not able to manage when bets went south, primarily in the form of falling housing prices. And, this is despite the fact that this 2000 law, the Commodities Futures Modernization Act, was passed specifically to reduce risk by ensuring legal certainty. And I want to show you just a really interesting segment of her law review article here. If you look at this paragraph, right, just because it says so much about kind of the current crypto debate a little bit, right? This one that starts with Brooksley Born resigned from her CFTC position. And basically there was a working group that was put in place that included Alan Greenspan, Robert Rubin, Larry Summers, really important people, that produced a report that dismissed the CFTC's concerns and critiques that attempt to exercise jurisdiction over OTC derivatives. According to the working group, a cloud of legal uncertainty has hung over the OTC derivatives market in the United States in recent years. This cloud, the working group fretted, could discourage innovation and growth of these important markets. And in the eyes of the working group, it was essential that the CEA, the Commodities Exchange Act, be amended to bring legal certainty and enforceability to all off-exchange derivatives trading. So I just thought that's fascinating in light of the discussion that we have in crypto about legal certainty. And it's actually a topic I'll get back to at the end, because I do think legal certainty is important in a certain concept. But ultimately, we had the financial crisis. And in response, I think that arguments like Stout's here actually gained a lot of traction, because ultimately the primary law that was meant to address what happened in the financial crisis, the Dodd-Frank law of 2010, which did a lot of stuff, but with respect to derivatives, it required that more types of derivatives trading occur on exchange. And although the OTC derivatives are still allowed amongst eligible contract participants, it requires that most derivatives trades be centrally cleared, like going through a regulated clearinghouse, so that kind of this risk situation can be monitored. Okay, are you bored yet? I'm not, but maybe you're interested in something else. We've learned a little bit about where we came from with financial derivatives, but what about sports betting, right? What about prediction markets? As I mentioned earlier, sports betting is just another form of a derivative, in the sense that it's a contract between parties that pays out based on the occurrence of some event, right? Whether the team you picked wins the Super Bowl. Now, the fascinating thing in researching this episode, the one thing I could not find a good answer to was, why hasn't the CFTC asserted jurisdiction over sports betting markets? And I have a theory, and it might be wrong, happy to be corrected, that a lot of it has to do with kind of the historic development of the sports betting markets, history again, right? Because historically, sports betting was illegal virtually everywhere in the US, except for Nevada, right? Vegas. And so the CFTC didn't really have to worry about these markets. However, a couple of years ago, the Supreme Court struck down that federal prohibition. You can kind of see the legal reasons elsewhere. But with the absence of a kind of federal prohibition on sports gambling, there's been a huge movement to set up regulated sports betting markets. However, all of those efforts have occurred at the state level, right? I think there's something along the lines of like 9 states now that that allow for sports betting in some fashion. But ultimately it results in like this patchwork of inconsistent laws that prevent any kind of national market from taking place. Presumably, this is again, my theory, is that the CFTC and Congress are just content to allow the states to own this market, even if it could be kind of easily argued that it falls under the definition of something like a derivative. All right. So that's sports betting. Now, like, let's talk about prediction markets more generally, because for those of us in crypto, you know, you're familiar with Augur, you've heard about the promise of a future with prediction markets and all sorts of events. Interesting case study, the prediction market for Hollywood box office receipts. Several entrepreneurs in the mid-2000s started developing the concept of markets for betting on the future success of big Hollywood movies, based on their total box office receipts. And they were successful. They were successful in convincing the CFTC that like approve these regulated marketplaces, in part based on the justification that they would actually provide great hedging products, insurance products for Hollywood studios that invest a ton of money in these movies with kind of the uncertainty of what the future payoff would be. And ultimately, just like anything, right? If you take a big risk and there's an uncertain payoff, it might be smart to hedge that risk. However, Hollywood hated these markets, right? In a kind of probably short-sighted view, they, ran to Congress. And in a case of terrible timing, the CFTC's approval of these markets came at the same time that Congress was debating Dodd-Frank, that 2010 law that was debating like how stringently does Congress need to clamp down on derivatives trading in the wake of the financial crisis. And so ultimately Hollywood was successful in lobbying Congress to add a barely seen section to Dodd-Frank that explicitly prohibits any type of derivative based on movie box office receipts. So let's go back for a second to this definition of a commodity. You'll see here, right, that there's a specific carve-out exception for motion picture box office receipts, and another one here, right? Literally, Congress said everything's a commodity except movie box office receipts, right? Which is really fascinating, and kind of is actually a good story for crypto. Like you think regulation is going to be this big comprehensive thing that covers all aspects of derivatives regulation, and ultimately, like, there's actually special little interest laws like that. If you're interested in this topic, let me tell you, this article, I love this article. It's in the Ringer from last fall. It's called Box Office Bomb, The Short Life of Popcorn Prediction Markets. Definitely worth a read if you're more interested in that topic. All right. I've gotten a little bit off track. You want me to get back to crypto. So let's talk about what this all means for crypto. As I mentioned, there's a ton of cool projects that are experimenting with smart contracts that at first blush look a little bit like derivatives. The UMA is the one I most closely follow. It's basically a smart contract protocol that allows anyone to mint a token that is linked to some external price feed. So if you want exposure to the long or short side of a trade, you deposit ETH into the smart contract. And then as the price moves on that price feed, the smart contract reallocates collateral between the two sides. We actually did an internal hackathon at 0x a few months ago, and Tom Schmidt, our product lead, made a really cool token that moves in value based on a price feed from Zillow that tracks the median home price in San Francisco. And ultimately, like, there's, it's a real elegant way of giving exposure to some underlying asset price, without owning the underlying, right? A derivative ultimately. And there's teams such as Market Protocol and DYDX who are kind of wrestling with similar issues. So with crypto, I actually think, like, as I've said before, I think smart contracts have the ability to, like, really lower the barriers to entry for creating these kinds of instruments in a way that allows for new trading of risk. A video I recommend here, my colleague Clay Robbins did a video on what he calls automated finance, which essentially refers to the ability to abstract away complex financial transactions for end users through smart contract technology. And at least it's an idea that really resonated with me. And I think that you can really see that at play with derivatives that in some cases require a lot of complexity, right? You have to figure out where the collateral lies, what the risk of each trade is. But you can kind of extract away that maybe down to a token level where that token just represents, the long or short of whether San Francisco real estate will go up or down. And so, like, you can think of some of the cool ideas that could come from this, right? For example, it seems that nobody in our political system wants to do anything about climate change. But, if you would agree with me that it's kind of this large existential risk to all of us, a prediction market that looks at something like the amount of carbon in the atmosphere or sea levels, that could ultimately be an interesting way of financially hedging against that risk. More kind of crypto native, I'm a really big fan of NFT artwork and, collectibles along those lines. But, ultimately, if you build up enough artwork or NFTs or whatever, you're taking on a decent amount of risk. And there could be kind of cool crypto native ways to hedge that risk through some of these kind of products. Just some things I'm interested in. But for the teams who are building this, or for the people, more importantly, that want to participate in these networks, right? Because it's not illegal necessarily to create the smart contract. What becomes unclear from a regulatory perspective is how the patchwork of regulations that I've talked about to date would apply to somebody who's building a one-off prediction market on some specific item on Augur. Ultimately, if an instrument meets the definition of a future or a swap, U.S. law says those trades can only occur on CFTC regulated marketplaces. And if you want to trade these things OTC, you're going to have to be a financial firm or really rich. And even in that case, you're going to have to go through a centralized clearinghouse. And, again, going back to the topic I mentioned before, prediction markets, like so much depends on which market you're talking about. Are you talking sports betting? Are you talking homeowners insurance? Like the regulations are going to change based on all of that. Now, despite these difficult regulatory issues, I think that it's important that we kind of engage on these topics, because I do think that smart contracts actually have a promise for in one case, actually like helping address the policy concerns of a lot of regulation. So if you go back to what I talked about, right, I see two big buckets of policy concerns. The first one being this concern around transparency and security and risk within the networks. And, centralized clearing is a way to mitigate that risk. But in researching this, I started to think a lot about, we call 0x a decentralized exchange protocol, but, it might be better characterized as like a decentralized clearing technology, right? Because trades can be executed in a lot of ways, right? You can go find a trader on an exchange, on an order book exchange. You can go, find a counterparty OTC. But ultimately, the trades get cleared through the smart contract. And in order to clear, they have to meet a bunch of rules, right? For example, you have to have sufficient collateral. There has to be the tokens in the account for the trade to occur. And so when we think about that policy concern around like, man, we need centralized clearing, there's actually an interesting discussion to be had about like, how can this type of technology maybe assist in that? And maybe one day we have a regulated 0x exchange, although I kind of doubt it. Now, going back to like with crypto, the thing that crypto definitely hasn't proven thus far is to have a solution to the second policy issue, which is, how do we mitigate purely speculative markets, right? That's one of the things the regulation is going to. Now, frankly, neither has traditional regulation all that much. But I think I guess I should say, from my research in this, I was actually moved by a lot of the arguments as to some of the problems with purely speculative markets. And it makes me really want to see teams in this open finance world working more to target markets where people can be provided with products that help hedge risk, right? Because I actually think there's like really cool ideas around there. Now, from a legal perspective, I also think it's a bit naive to think that speculation can be stamped out altogether. And the best example of why that's the case is sports betting and the history of sports betting, right? I mean, Americans have, for years, in the face of a federal ban on sports betting, bet billions of dollars in sports bets. Now, we all enjoy participating in the local office pool for NCAA tournament. Most of us don't want to see, some degenerate gambler get addicted and lose all their money on some meaningless sports match. So how the law wrestles with that issue, giving people the sufficient liberty to, enjoy some speculative amount of betting while also ensuring that like markets and instruments are focused on more hedging of risk than speculation, is a really difficult and interesting problem. Two things I want to end with here. First, if you're inside crypto and if you're outside, you may have seen a lot of discussion around the social benefit of prediction markets in terms of serving as a reliable indicator of the likelihood of a certain event. So the so-called wisdom of the crowds, right? It can actually provide helpful data points. If futures markets can show that a reliable way of predicting the future price of stocks or corn, then it makes sense that like those markets could also be really helpful in predicting future levels of carbon in the atmosphere or who's going to win the upcoming presidential primary, which is like helpful to know the answer to those questions, or at least have a good sense. And I think this concept is really intriguing. There's many academic articles out there that explain the benefits of prediction markets for this purpose. All I can say is in studying the regulatory history, it doesn't seem like there was kind of a meaningful discussion around some of these benefits. And so, listen, I don't have a strong view, but if you think these are important or if that should be kind of included in the regulatory debate, I think there's going to have to be more discussion on that front. All right. Last thing I want to leave you with, because I think it's kind of interesting. Here's my hot take that I'll walk out of here on. Many commentators have noted that smart contracts are neither smart nor contracts, right? They are computer programs that follow some coded logic, and they differ fundamentally from the legal concept that I have of a contract, or that you probably have of a contract. My friend and fellow lawyer, Patrick Merck at Harvard's Berkman Center, he makes this argument a lot. And even thoughtful commentators like Andreas Antonopoulos have wrestled with this issue. I'll put a link to a really interesting video he has wrestling with this idea that smart contracts aren't really contracts. But if you rewind this video and go back to the start, you'll hear me explain that when we talk about a derivative, we're ultimately talking about a contract, right? A contract in the form of a bet on a future event. But if a smart contract isn't a contract, even if the person interacting with this computer program is trying to be placed in a similar economic position as somebody would, who enters a traditional derivatives contract, this is a kind of a weird question. Like, do any of these rules apply? Like, who are you contracting with? The smart contract? How do you go and enforce that contract? Is it based on the expectations of the user who's using that smart contract protocol? Or is it based on how the program was coded, which presumably is going to have the outcome that it does when you use it? Now, don't take this as advice as to go out and trade a bunch of tokenized derivatives. I think the definition of these instruments in the law is very broad, and there is no consensus that would suggest that those definitions don't actually cover tokenized derivatives. But it's a concept, like a lot of legal issues involving this tech, that I think deserves more discussion. And that gets back to the topic I talked about earlier about legal certainty. A lot of people want legal certainty around crypto because they want to know, what am I allowed to do? What am I not allowed to do? Which, as we can see in historical senses, could have some bad consequences. What I think is really interesting is where I want to have some more legal certainty is on these very first principle topics, right? Is a smart contract a contract? What does that mean? How is it different if it is? That's where I think really it'll get really interesting with some of the legal certainty, because then that will have follow-on impacts of how does derivatives regulation apply? Well, I hope you found that as interesting as I did. Generally, we take questions from users. No questions were sent in, but I hope you have some questions or you're interested in seeing this stuff and you want to tell me about it. If so, send those to me on Twitter, on Discord. I'm pretty publicly available. Otherwise, I hope you liked this video. If you did like the video, subscribe to our channel. There's great content like Clay Robbins' video on automated finance. And until next time, keep it decentralized.